Guruve Gaura Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vaibhacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasati Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam devotees. I am trying to catch up on the question and answer sessions. I'm trying to open up the question now. So I did receive a question. To be brief, I've got some other services to do. And I answered the question back personally to that person. They wrote back again saying and asking why I did not answer the question really on the public forum in my question and answer sessions. And I mentioned to him that I think I've perhaps dealt with discussion on this before, and that probably they could research among the videos to see where I had discussed this before. And then they wrote also that their experience has been, I'm paraphrasing now, that speaking to many devotees and many different sanghas and many different leaders in many different sanghas, that there seemed to be a tendency, Dandavat Sadhana Siddha Prabhu, there seemed to be a tendency to skirt the issue of certain social conditions and social considerations, and that it doesn't appear that there are many public discussions on these various things. And they complimented that I seem to have been willing in other cases to discuss certain things that were not directly related to our philosophical standards or siddhanta. So if I could please address this in a public way. So I have mentioned in the past that by preference, and I think for my own welfare, because I'm also always doing this for my own edification and also as a savor to the Vaishnava community, that I do have preference to try to, involve myself more in the discussion of things that are siddhantically viable for us to progress in bhakti. And I realize that in some cases that may expand into arenas where we need to take considerations in a pragmatic way in order to help us to better digest and apply siddhantic conceptions or theological conceptions as far as bhakti is concerned. But I also felt that I didn't want to make the person feel like, since they have some faith by watching other videos, that I would, quote, skirt an issue like this, right? But at the same time, I wanted to be clear that there is a difference, which is why I titled the particular discussion not exactly what you asked, but I titled the discussion for the benefit of giving a deeper level of understanding about the subject matter and about how controversy arises over these subject matters. So I do remember, so let me first clarify what the person's asking about. They're asking about the dynamics of alternative sexuality. And they're asking about, in particularly, the controversies that have arisen regarding trans individuals and so forth and so on. So I don't know whom, Mataji, you've spoken to previously about it, and so forth and so on. And I don't know what replies they've given you because you didn't put that here. And I'm not sure if it was a perception that they were skirting the issue, or maybe it could have been genuine. I don't know because I've not seen what their responses were. but I think I did make an earlier video regarding a friend of mine who asked me a question in this arena, and I gave some answers based on that. So I'm going to reiterate that because I don't have anything particularly new to say in that regard. So, of course, that question revolved around someone who simply their own individual lifestyle was regarding homosexuality. So it was not involving trans life, etc., etc. So, but anyway, the point being here that each individual person, when they come into this world, they come with a particular karmic DNA and a particular karmic portfolio. That karmic portfolio and the individual karmic DNA kind of gives a outline of the life perspective that a person has. So we are all shaped to some degree by the impressions that come from that karmic DNA or karmic portfolio, as well as if someone is practicing bhakti, because your question in part involved all of this in relation to the practice of bhakti, or I probably would not have addressed it, right? Also depends on the bhakti samskars, because our life in bhakti, our maturation in bhakti, is also very much dependent on previous bhakti samskars. It is mentioned by Rupa Goswami Pad, what is it? Praktanaka aduni chasti yat sat bhakti vasana. So bhakti vasana means impressions coming from bhakti in both previous lives and in our current life. So everybody's overall perspective is shaped by those things. And the constant endeavors in the path of bhakti is what begins to, for lack of a better word, weed out those things which are unfavorable and clarify those things which are favorable to obtain the goal of bhakti, which in sadhana is to obtain bhav, or a pure state of love towards God, right? As far as you mentioned also in the extent of your question, that you wanted pragmatic understanding of why there's always controversy around these things, and you didn't want, as again, quote, you're saying, which I think we also have to be careful here, because you're saying that you don't want simply another philosophical explanation, but you want a pragmatic answer. So one is, by tone, even though I understand you, and therefore I understand that you don't have a intention to make a demand, so to speak, but others may have considered that tone, that I don't want any philosophical necessary discussion. I just want a pragmatic answer to why there's controversy, would seem to be that you're looking for a particular response and not open to a dialogue or open to hearing variables that may allow you to come to a particular conclusion on things. So that being said, I'm going to try to give some pragmatic answer as well. So I've already started by stating that everybody has a particular karmic portfolio and karmic DNA, and that shapes their worldview and their perspective until the bhakti samskars become thick enough to then give a more absolute perspective on things. While their perspective is still in the process of having relative influences from their material samskars as well, they may have various subjective experiences, and those subjective experiences may come in a myriad of ways. So, of course, under discussion here is the nature of a person's sexual orientation or self-conception, because now, in common parlance, it's become that it's not a matter of just sexual orientation, but it is a matter of self-identification, right? So, in that regard, a person's self-identification, their perspective based on that subjective self-identification, everything shapes how they look at everything. So in this way, we have to acknowledge, yes, there is something which is a subjective experience. And I'm going to couch it the same way I've explained it before. There is a subjective experience. That subjective experience can't be denied because it is the culmination of their karmic DNA. So it is a reality. It's a perspective gleaned from karma. And therefore, in this particular karmic iteration, that subjective experience is real to them. The issue is that those subjective experiences are as vast as there are people in the world, right? So everybody has subjective experiences, which is the unique culmination of their karmic DNA. We tend to interact with people, however, on a basis of objective experience. You understand? So we have subjective experiences. We interact with people on the basis of objective experiences. So while I'm speaking about that, however, I need to bring in one point, and forgive me if it appears to be philosophical, and that's that there is also an absolute perspective. Now, that is more difficult to digest as long as we stay in the relative paradigm. As long as we are operating in a relative basis, it's hard to digest there's something which is absolute, because that comes as a result of spiritual maturation. But there is an absolute truth, right? But I cannot speak honestly without bringing in that point. But then let's go to the relative paradigm and discuss it from that angle of vision. So everyone has a subjective experience, but we interact on the basis of objective experiences. So if you really look at things carefully, there is very little controversy between a person having a subjective experience and interacting with other people who may have a different both subjective experience and there may be a different objective experience. If the basis of everything is going to be respect, which is what you have indicated in the other part of your writing to me, that the idea that there should be respect for the particular individuality, as you couched it, of people in terms of their sexuality, that should be respected, as well all the subjective and objective experiences of people should also be respected. If you looked at it from that angle of vision, I'm not bringing in any absolute perspective here, I'm just bringing in even from a relative perspective. If that mutual respect was given, then there would not be a problem. So what is it that is the creation of a problem of interaction between these experiences? And to make this more clear, so it doesn't sound like, confused, if somebody's subjectively experiencing themselves, though they objectively present as male, but they experience themselves as female, then in interacting with people, it could be acknowledged your subjective experience is that you are female. But your objective presentation, interacting with others, is that you are male. Right? If that is the case, and all experiences are being respected, there would not be an issue. I think that's cool. There would not be an issue. Because even from your subjective experience of feeling that though I have a male presentation, I identify as a female, you would respect that, yes, in the objective experience of people, I'm a male. That would not be problematic if you were relatively speaking, if you were self-confident, self-assured, self-validated regarding your subjective experience. Then it would be, yes, this is how I experience myself. And in interacting with other people, I realize there is something called an objective experience. And in the objective experience, people are experiencing me as a male because that's my objective presentation. So really, from that angle of vision, that simple angle of vision, there would not be any problem. There wouldn't be any problem. Because you would, as you're asking for respect of your subjective experience, you would also respect the subjective and objective experience of other people. And therefore, there would be mutual consideration based on respect. Because nobody can force you to say that you don't have that subjective experience. I'm not saying people don't do that. I'm saying in truth, nobody can. People can say it, they can, do whatever, but generally speaking, nobody can tell you that what your subjective experience is not your subjective experience. But in the same way, you cannot take your subjective experience and eradicate the subjective and objective experience of other people. Because when that happens, that is the cause of clashing, confusion, controversy, so forth and so on. So it is never a matter, we've not even touched anything about the absolute truth here. We're speaking strictly in relative terms here, right? But if you were to acknowledge that, and that was simply put on the table in that format, everybody would be able to understand it clearly. Okay, you subjectively experience yourself as male, even though you may have, female presentation to others or vice versa. And others experiencing you according to the objective experience see you as male or female, even though your subjective experience may be different. And that being the case, then these things would not arise as a controversy. So what is making them arise as such a controversial issue? That's why I put in the title that there is social engineering. And social engineering is a way in which the society, because we'd be naive to think that the social fabric is just running organically based on just love and consideration for everybody, and that there aren't those persons who have the ability, based on wealth, power, and influence, to shape the overall social fabric. We'd just be naive if we thought that wasn't the case. We don't even see that historically, even from a scriptural point of view. You read in our Srimad Bhagavatam, which is our Mool Praman for everything, that there are various kings, and those kings ruled, and when they ruled, there was a particular social fabric that was observed during the course of their rule. So we acknowledge that historically. Why would we not acknowledge now that wealth, influence, and power help to shape the social fabric, on a, worldwide basis? Especially when you have a situation where you can see publicly that there are many forums in which wealth, influence, and power and people related to that category gather to have discussions on those very things. So then we shouldn't think that because basically the way our social fabric is shaped is according to the information content that's put out over various forms of media. And if we don't control that media, then obviously those who do have the platform in which to shape basically the social fabric. And if a person does not have a deep filter, which would be based from the position of spirituality, because spirituality is the only thing which has the ability to filter the material information content from the actual being, the soul, right? Not to get philosophical on you since you didn't want that, but that spirituality is really the only thing that has the ability to filter, right, the social material energy away from the soul. If there's a lack of that, then for most people, their conscious engagement is in the material energy, and that material energy is being controlled and socially engineered by those who have wealth, influence, and power. And I just gave one example of how. It's through media, right? All kinds of media, right? So the basis of the social fabric is shaped like that. So then the question will become, why, if we just discussed the most simple format of respect that would have avoided so much antagonism, visceral hatred one to another, division among different groups, if there's a simple formula for that being avoided, why is it not employed? Because perhaps it is advantageous to those who are providing the social engineering to have division, controversy, etc. That's another tract of thought, and I don't really want to go down that thought. I think anybody who's interested in that ideal should do the research and go down and see historically how things have shaped out, and you'll get a bigger behind the scenes picture of what's going on. I don't want to go down that track anymore, right? I've been down that rabbit hole, so to speak. And, I think it's once you've seen what it is what it is. But even behind that, we accept and understand that is actually, which is why I put also in the title, it is actually also the progression of Kali Yuga. Part of Kali Yuga, Manda Sumanda Matiyog, Manda Bhagya Yuga, that people will be short-lived, angry, quarrelsome. And the agents that facilitate the agency of Kali will socially engineer things to be like that. So something as simple as what you're talking about could have been reconciled in the simple format that we spoke in the beginning, but it's not, because those who are doing the social engineering don't want it that way, because being agents of Kali, they're carrying out the effects of what Kali is. To create division, quarrel, so many things. You can read 12th Canto Srimad Bhagavatam, and you can look at all the various categories of degradation and so forth that goes on during Kali, and you'll get a very good picture of lining that up with contemporary social dynamics and see, oh yeah, this is all lining up. That really should increase your faith in bhakti, quite frankly. Also, there is a speciality about this Kali Yuga. It is called Danya Kali. Because another thing simultaneously is happening. While there is the most degraded aspect of the four periods, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali, this particular Kali Yuga is special because of the appearance of Srimad Mahaprabhu. So you also have another dynamic going on, where you have the most degraded energy, which is the nature of Kali Yuga. You have the highest distribution and dissemination of spirituality in the form of what Srimad Mahaprabhu came to give. So in this verse, Anarpita Chirim Chirat Karunavatina Kalo, Sumutpayatam Unata Ujwala Rasa Subhakti Sriyam. Right? Again, I'm going to try to stay away, as you asked, from philosophical considerations, but the polarity of this dynamic, where the highest spiritual thing is given in the lowest spiritual climate, is exacerbated by the nature of the force of the attack of the agents of Kali. Because such a valuable thing is at hand. So it means the double efforts, triple efforts of the agent and agency of Kali are present. Because there's so much value in what is available in this Kali Yuga, the agency of this Kali Yuga is also very, very intense. And therefore, these kind of socially engineered dynamics, whether it's on the basis of sexuality, on the basis of race, on the basis of culture, on the basis of social status, are firmly being rooted. Because whenever there is division, the philosophy of relativity becomes very prominent. And I mentioned this before. The first thing that is relativized is God, because God represents the absolute truth. It does not matter which path of God you're talking about here. Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, quote, Hinduism, Vaishnav Dharma, whatever it is, the attack on the absolute nature of the supremacy of the divine being, or God, is attacked first by relativizing that idea. Even the idea, you can say you believe in God, but you have the opportunity not to believe in God. Really, there's no such thing? Because you cannot say, we can have a discussion about believing or not believing in something if the thing doesn't exist. You understand? If the thing doesn't exist, it would not come in our purview to discuss it. And I've often challenged to come up with a discussion on something that does not exist. So immediately you'll have people come up with ideas, oh, well, you could discuss flying pink elephants. But actually, flight exists. The color pink exists. Elephants exist. We've never seen that combination in our experience. So then you can go down the philosophical, academic framework to say, well, that proves that that doesn't exist. No, it's just not in your experience. That's for one thing. But the point being, you've truly not come up with something that doesn't exist, because it's not in human capacity to express something that's not in existence. You understand? This thought is very important. We can only speak about, debate about, talk about, philosophize on things that actually exist. So the existence of God is proved in the fact that there's a discussion about whether it exists or not. So you can do this experiment, right? You'll find that people will never be able to name something that the components of what they're naming don't exist. Because it's not in the human capacity to create something out of nothing. You understand? Which is just further proof we're not God, right? All right. So, back to our original point. Therefore, if you looked at it from that angle of vision, right, just within the relative material paradigm, there really is not an ill intent, a phobia, or a demonization of people's subjective experience until it touches the socially engineered dynamic, which encourages people in division and to give rise to an antagonism one to another regarding their difference. Other than that, as I gave simple explanation at the very beginning, if there was an idea, which is, if you look at it, at the basis of everything is a person wants to be respected or acknowledged for their subjective experience. Why would anyone think that therefore others don't want the same courtesy? So if you are a person who's experiencing a certain subjective experience which doesn't align with your objective presentation, it should be very easy to understand, if you want respect for that, that you would respect the objective experience of others and their subjective experience. Right? Because their subjective experiences, even if you don't take the idea of God, spirituality as an absolute thing, you would still have to acknowledge it as a subjective experience of many people. And their subjective experience, like your subjective experience, shapes their worldview. So where in their worldview, based on their subjective experience of understanding God and their relation with God, they may have certain ways that they conduct themselves. And based on that, it is not an antagonism or some kind of being against your subjective experience. It is their own subjective experience that they're having. So in this way, long story short, if you have the idea that I would like to be respected for my subjective experience, right? Just extend that same ideal to your interactions with others, right? That, yeah, they're having a subjective experience and an objective experience, and so that should be respected. So I'm not going to go into detail about all the things that you brought up, right? Because they're popular social issues, and I just think we'll probably get way beyond the purview of what is worthwhile for me to talk about. I'm an insignificant person, so I'm just giving a perspective. And I think I've tried to create an essence of communicating that rather than to go down the track, because you spoke about all the different political issues around, you know, males and females competing and all these various things. But if you were to take that formula that I just spoke about, it would be applicable into all of those categories, right? Like in the category that you spoke about of men and women competing, well, there is an objective experience that we all have, that we look at competition based on fairness, right? And that fairness is judged by making a kind of equal platform for people to begin their competition, and then you really see the nature of competition come out when there is equality as a flat line or as a baseline for acknowledging a particular winner or somebody who demonstrates proficiency or excellence in that category, but they're doing it from a baseline of equality and competition against others in that particular field, whatever the field might be. And then there's always a criteria for how that is set up. You understand? Just like if you competed in any kind of martial sports, then even there, they'll have weight categories. So you try to create a baseline of fairness based on letting people of a certain weight compete with people of that same weight. So there is a baseline of the competition. And that's pretty simple, objective perspective, right? But when social engineering comes in, it takes those very basic objective experiences and turns them into ideological differences, and therefore pits one person against another based on that. And especially as those who are trying to be devotees, where we're trying to introduce light, right? Because it's mentioned in Srimad Bhagavatam, Purana Arako Dinodita, after the disappearance of Bhagavan, after the disappearance of Dharma, which goes along with Bhagavan, light in this world will come from the Bhagavad Puran. And each devotee is obliged in their practice of bhakti to try to come to the stage where they themselves are a ray of the teachings of Srimad Bhagavatam. I'm only speaking now within our context. Of course, this could be spread out to those who are genuinely practicing Christianity or Islam or any other spiritual path, should be a genuine ray of the light of the truth of that spiritual teaching, that absolute teaching. Right? So I've addressed this from a relative point of view. I've minimized addressing it from an absolute point of view, right? I would feel remiss if I didn't do that, though, to some degree. So I'm just going to add one thing here before we close out. That's that from an absolute perspective, obviously, the baseline of everything is we're not the material body, and therefore we're not the particular karmic iteration we're going through. That's absolute reality, right? Because anything that is absolute has some sense of permanence. But we know that we don't have a permanent status as John Doe in this life, male or female, or any subjective experience of either one. That's not a permanent thing. It is a particular karmic portfolio in one life, and then another karmic portfolio will unfold in another life based on our activities now. So we know beyond that is the soul itself, which is an absolute position. And the nature of that absolute position is that it has a relationship with the absolute truth or with God. So that's an absolute perspective. So without going into any detail or getting into any depth, then that absolute experience informs us that all of this, right, all of these relative discussions, right, really, if they were based in that understanding, would even more bring us to the point where we could be unified around the idea, yes, we're having a subjective karmic experience, but actually we are the soul. And every single soul has the same designation. That designation is that they're the das or servant of God. So I'm using that term generically because it does not matter what spiritual ideal you're practicing, right? That's a different discussion about the nuances of the ability to realize dasitva or your position in relation to God. That's a different theological discussion, but just in general, the soul being the servant of God and being universally applicable across spiritual practices, that position is ultimately unifying. Therefore, you'll find that those who are being agents of Kali, the first thing they seem to want to do is to relativize that position of absolute truth and absolute God, etc., etc. Then by making everything relative, it gives rise to those who can control the relative narrative. They can then institute control. That's just facts. That's just facts, right? And in executing that relative control, you certainly want to stay away from the possibility of people coming together in any kind of unified mass situation based on any unifying principle. And the ultimate unifying principle would be God. Therefore, they even create division among religions. Well, since you do this way, they're different from you, so that should be a cause of friction. You understand? But the ideal of every soul being the servant of God, when you break things down to its root, right? That's a commonality in any genuine spiritual situation. But they don't want people being unified on that basis. You understand? They want people divided because obviously it's easier to control smaller groups of people where you can socially engineer things which would control that group, as opposed to trying to deal with a mass of people, especially when there's so much flow of communication. We live in an information age, and you start to get people nourishing each other's unified nature around God or something. That can be very problematic for an agenda which seeks to make human beings with wealth, influence, and power, right, subject to that kind of unified principle. You understand? All right. So again, this is not something I didn't want to, as you quote, skirt this issue, as you mentioned. So I spoke about it. I think you are a practicing devotee, and so I think one thing that will be important is to, as you go on in your practice, you're looking for maturation in the practice of understanding the soul's relationship with Bhagavan. That becomes the paramount use of the time in this life. So we're not being naive, or you quoted another thing that's popular, spiritual bypassing, the whole idea of what pragmatically happens within the social fabric. But many devotees are very steeped, actually, you'd be surprised, in understanding the backdrop of all of this, but realizing their best and most effective means of moving forward and even being an agency of service to Bhagavan is to give the light of spiritual and absolute truth as a counteractive measure against the social engineering of those of wealth, influence, and power who seek to relativize everything and become agents of Kali. So hopefully this was helpful, and I spoke honestly as well. So I'm hoping that, whether you are able to take just the relative portion, or whether you, as you mentioned, you were kind to me in giving compliment that you've appreciated the spiritual context of posts that I've made, then try applying and deepening those things spiritually. At the same time, take a deep consideration even of the relative and pragmatic things that I spoke about. And when you look at it from that angle of vision, you can see where many things would not be problematic if there was not a socially engineered agenda that creates a kind of atmosphere of controversy, discord, etc., etc. All right, my Dandavat Pranams, Mataji. And also, my Dandavats to your group as well. The group of the elderly ladies also. And they're very nourishing for you also in your association. And par our discussion that we had once before about Varnashram and all of that, I still firmly say that living in an inner city at this point is, it's mentioned in Bhagavatam, it will become more and more problematic, because in cities where there is so much influence of Kali, right? Because it tends to come in places where, city life is prominent, right? Of course, if one is spiritually situated, then no matter where you are, you're spiritually situated. But, speaking from a point of view of our unfoldment, yeah, better to be in places where the atmosphere even can be more dominated by the mutual spiritual encouragement in your group. So if you have that facility, the group has that facility. Right now, I know everybody's living in a particular city, but it's, if that's possible, even to work out a plan to in the future make it possible. I know many people are still working also, so it's not an easy thing, but just to think about that. And in the meantime, certainly coming together continuously to have discussions and to chant together, as you said you do, all of those things are very, very helpful and important. All right, my Dandavat Pranams. Jai Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhuvevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Haribol Radhe Radhe. For other questions that were written in, I'm trying to catch up little by little on those questions. And some people I've written back or answered questions directly because I realized that I didn't really have full time. I'm trying to plan my travel for Harikatha, also for the summer. So there's been some kind of busyness with trying to get everything prepared for that, and so forth and so on. I definitely will try to make 2 trips this year because health seems to be okay. I'm praying to Guru Gauranga that it stays like that. But I'll try to make at least 2 trips. And then I've spoken to my good wife. We're certainly trying to make the promise to get back to the West Coast as well for Harikatha. And so I'm praying that devotees will bestow their kindness on me and their mercies, and pray that that somehow will be facilitated. Right? All right, my Dandavat Pranam. Jai Radhe Radhe. Oh, somebody's asking a question. Oh, Jamavadi, Didi asking, can you please restate what the question was? Didi, it was one devotee wrote a sort of long series of questions, and the basis of the question was that they had experienced regarding the contemporary issue around transgender, especially, that many persons they had spoken to, both in leadership and in the general devotee community, in different sanghas, seemed to have skirted the issue. Then they went on to describe many, many other things. So I was addressing that particular issue because I have some relationship with, there's a small grouping of those ladies. They have a small grouping. They live in one city. I never mention people's personal business, and I won't do it ever here. But they have their own small grouping. So she was just asking about that. She was asking about that, and I explained to her, as if you hear back on the whole video that I made here, that really from a person-to-person, heart-to-heart level of discussion, it's not as problematic as it is made to be by the element of social engineering which is added to it based on ideological agendas. And I mentioned how those agendas really are meant to keep people in a divided state, and therefore it keeps people from having heart-to-heart discussions and realizing some sense of just mutual respect, even, especially in this regard, right? So you could look back at the tape and see what my answer was. Understand? All right, Haribol, Dandavats.